If stories like this stay with you, support the channel by subscribing and staying for the next one. For more stories about love, deception, and the truths people hide behind beautiful lives, subscribe. My wife told me she was in love with someone else while fastening a diamond earring in the mirror, and asked if I could still please make it through the gala without embarrassing her. She said it in the same tone she used when asking me to pick up dry cleaning. Not cruelly, that would have required effort, more like a woman trying to move one inconvenient piece off a board, so the evening could proceed on schedule. I remember the window behind her, all Chicago winter and river glass, the room lit in amber from the sconces we chose together, the black dress laid across the bed, the smell of her perfume opening slowly into the air like something expensive and poisonous. I remember my own hand still on my cufflink, not moving. "Say that again," I said. Vivienne turned from the mirror, just enough to see whether I looked dangerous. "I didn't. That was the first mistake she made that night. I didn't mean for you to find out before tonight," she said, with a practiced exhale, as if we were already in the part of the marriage where my feelings had to be managed rather than considered. "But the board is expecting us. Grant will be there. And if you make a scene, you'll only make this uglier for everyone." Grant, she said his name like I already knew how much room it had taken up inside her. In truth, by then I did. I had known for 22 days. That was how long it had been since I found the reservation confirmation hidden inside our printer queue for a suite at the Halbrook on a Thursday afternoon, when she had told me she was in Evanston meeting donors. How long it had been since I saw the duplicate rideshare receipts and the impossible sequence of calendar edits, and the private number that kept appearing and disappearing from her call log, as if discretion itself had become part of the seduction. How long it had been since I stopped being a husband in the soft, hopeful sense of the word, and became what I had always been best at under pressure: quiet. My name is Julian Hart. I was 42 that winter. I was the kind of man people trust with complicated things. Professionally, I worked in forensic accounting for a large restructuring firm downtown, which means I made a living tracing movement other people hoped would stay invisible. Hidden losses, misreported exposure, quiet transfers, timelines no one wants to see lined up in one place. I was good at it because numbers, unlike people, do not panic when exposed. They simply settle into whatever truth they were always holding. Most people who knew me socially described me as controlled. Vivienne used to call me impossible to rattle. For 11 years of marriage, that had been a compliment. By the end, it became the reason she thought I would take the humiliation politely. From the outside, we looked ideal in the glossy, urban way people often mistake for intimacy. Good apartment, better art than we could technically justify when we bought most of it. The right dinners, the right vacations, her in silk and hard heels, and a smile that made strangers talk too much. Me in dark suits, and the sort of quiet confidence women in their 40s notice, and women in their 30s misread as emotional unavailability, until they need a man to actually hold a room together. Vivienne worked in development and brand strategy for a boutique hospitality group run by Grant Avery, who had made a fortune building hotels for people who wanted discretion more than luxury, and liked to pretend those things were different. He was younger than me by 4 years, better looking in the obvious ways, broader smile, softer hands, the kind of man who learned early that making women feel seen cost him nothing and paid astonishing returns. My wife had been working with him for 3 years when the affair started. At least that was when it started physically. Emotionally, I think it began earlier, somewhere in the widening quiet between us. Somewhere after she decided my steadiness had become a room she could leave without technically moving out of it. The first change in her was not distance. It was brightness. That was what I noticed before I could name anything worse. She started coming home from work with a charge in her face that had nothing to do with me. She'd drop her bag in the entry and stand in the kitchen, answering one last text with a softness around her mouth I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Her phone began sleeping face down, then in her purse, then in the bathroom when she showered. If I asked how her day was, she gave me too much texture in the wrong places and none where it counted. Long, she'd say, 2 donor calls, 1 impossible chef, a panel run-through, and Grant almost lost his mind over floral budgets. Grant's name was everywhere at first, then nowhere. That was worse. People hiding nothing do not suddenly become pronoun-heavy. One Thursday in late November, she came home in a cream blouse I'd never seen before and kissed me on the cheek, while I was reading quarterly exposure summaries at the dining table. "You're working too hard," she said. It was a loving sentence in structure and a dismissive one in tone. I looked up and saw a car receipt folded into the seam of her tote, where the leather bent open. Halbrook Valet. At the time, I told myself it meant nothing. A donor lunch, a board meeting, a coffee in the hotel bar because downtown was impossible and parking in River North was a blood sport. I did what decent husbands do when they do not want to become suspicious men. I accepted the easier explanation. 3 days later, I saw a charge from the Halbrook on our Amex and a matching reimbursement from her corporate card that had been manually entered without the usual event code. That was when the room inside me got very still. The thing people who have never been betrayed do not understand is how often the body knows first. Not the mind, the body. Your jaw tightens while your thoughts are still generous. Your stomach goes hollow while your heart is still defending the person who is about to injure it. My body knew before I admitted anything to myself that a line had already been crossed. I didn't confront her then. That is not who I am. I made tea. I smiled. I asked if she wanted to spend Thanksgiving with my sister or hers. Then, after she fell asleep, I sat in my office and started building a file. There are two kinds of hurt in marriage. There is the first hurt, where you still hope you are wrong. And then there is the second, colder kind, where you realize being right will not save your dignity, so you might as well become precise. I became precise. I checked timelines first, calendar sync remnants on the shared tablet in the kitchen, car service receipts, expense reimbursements, the old printer queue she never thought to clear because she forgot it logged previews automatically when sending from her work laptop, private dining reservations under donor initials that were not donors, a sweet charge buried in a hospitality vendor bundle, a florist invoice delivered to Grant's office and billed to one of Vivienne's discretionary event budgets. Then came the phone pattern, not through anything criminal or dramatic, not spyware, not a movie, just ordinary digital laziness. The residue people leave everywhere when they think deleting is the same as disappearing. A call log mirrored once to our desktop months earlier. Authentication fragments, a cloud token she forgot to revoke. Cached banner text from a synced app preview. Enough to tell me the shape of it. Enough to tell me the affair was old enough to have its own habits. Enough to tell me she was not confused. The first message I read was 3 lines from Grant. Tomorrow. Use the side elevator. No one from the board will be there till 5. Wear the black one. I stared at those words until I had to put the phone down. Not because they were especially intimate. Because they were ordinary. That is the most devastating thing about betrayal. Once it becomes established, it grows efficient. It loses the trembling quality of sin and hardens into scheduling. By the time I closed the laptop that first night, I knew 3 things. Vivienne was sleeping with Grant. It had been going on for months, and my marriage had already ended somewhere inside her long before she gave me the courtesy of language. The next morning, she came into the kitchen in one of my old Oxford shirts and kissed the back of my neck while I poured coffee. That gesture almost undid me, not because it made me believe in her innocence, because it showed me how much of our life she was still willing to perform while reserving the truest parts of herself elsewhere. I wish I could tell you I was noble after that. I was not. I was quiet, and quiet in the right man is often much more dangerous than rage. The public scene she was begging me not to ruin that winter night was the Avery Foundation Gala at the Halbrook. Grant's pet event, big donors, museum board members, hospitality people with expensive teeth, architects and minor celebrities, and that whole exhausting ecosystem of people who pretend philanthropy is a moral instinct rather than reputation laundering with champagne. Vivienne had spent 2 months shaping the night, and somewhere along the way she had decided that if our marriage finally had to die, it would do so on her terms. Tidy, controlled, and after she had moved the emotional furniture where she wanted it. That was what her line in the bedroom really meant. Please don't embarrass me tonight. Not please don't be hurt. Not please don't ask questions. Not even please don't leave me before I can explain myself. Just don't embarrass me. I looked at her there in the mirror, fastening the second earring with fingers that had probably fastened his collar the same way. And I felt something strange and clarifying happen inside me. I stopped grieving the version of her I had loved. Not all at once, but enough. I won't embarrass you, I said. She searched my face for sarcasm and found none. That unsettled her more than anger would have. I put on my jacket, adjusted my tie, watched relief move through her body like warmth. That was her second mistake. The third had happened 2 weeks earlier, though she didn't know it yet when I met Mara Avery, Grant's wife. I didn't seek her out of revenge. Not initially. I went to her because by then I knew enough about Grant's habits to realize this wasn't his first time. And men like that rarely leave only one person behind them with evidence. Mara answered my email because I used one sentence, and because I chose it carefully. I think our spouses have given each other a version of the truth that leaves us both standing outside it. She wrote back within 20 minutes. We met in a quiet hotel lounge off the river, where no one in her social circle would expect to find her at 2 in the afternoon. She was taller than Vivienne, darker, calmer, less obviously pretty until she lifted her eyes and held yours too long. She had the stillness of a woman who had been privately disappointed for long enough that surprise had stopped being useful to her. When I told her what I knew, she didn't cry. When I showed her the receipts, she didn't even flinch. Instead, she reached into her own bag and put a folded sheet of paper on the table. A private school admissions calendar, 2 highlighted dates, 1 fundraiser weekend, 1 strategy retreat. Grant had told her he'd be in New York for both. He hadn't. That was how it began. Not with desire, with corroboration. There is a dangerous intimacy in being believed immediately by someone whose humiliation mirrors your own. You do not have to explain the shape of the wound. They already know the outline. Myra and I spent the next 2 weeks doing what betrayed people in controlled marriages always do when they still have functioning adult lives and no room for melodrama. We built timelines, compared dates, matched alibis, cross-checked lies. Grant, it turned out, was sloppier than Vivienne gave him credit for. Multiple hotel bookings, reused side elevators, a preference for Tuesday afternoons, and donor travel weekends. Messages to Vivienne that were warmer than he ever was with Mara in public and colder than he should have been with any woman in private. It was in the middle of those meetings that the line between us blurred. Not because we intended it to, because pain is magnetic when someone else names it properly. Mara listened the way Vivienne had stopped listening years earlier. She never rushed my sentences toward advice, never softened anything that didn't deserve softening. She was sharp where Vivienne had become evasive, self-possessed where Vivienne had become slippery. In another life, I would have admired her from a safe distance and called it chemistry. In that life, I sat too long across from her with truth spread between us and felt something far less clean begin to form. The first time I touched her, it was to stop her from crushing the stem of her wineglass after reading one of Grant's messages to Vivienne aloud. "You're bleeding," I said. The glass had bitten into her palm. She looked down, then up at me, and there it was. That pause human beings make when they understand a line still exists and know exactly how easy it would be to cross it. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not." Neither of us moved. Then my hand stayed where it was too long. That's the truth. No more and no less. Nothing happened that night, but after that, everything had changed. By the time of the gala, Myra and I had already crossed enough emotional ground that pretending otherwise would have been its own lie. We had kissed once, in the back seat of a car service after a donor luncheon, where Vivienne and Grant spent the entire meal speaking to each other with the sort of polished distance that only exists when 2 people have already been intimate enough to manufacture detachment convincingly. The kiss shocked me not because it felt wrong, because it felt inevitable. I thought about it every hour after. I hated myself for that. I also did not stop. At 8:10 that night, the ballroom at the Halbrook was all white flowers, black glass, gold light, and money trying to look charitable. Vivienne moved through it like she had designed the air. Grant stood near the stage greeting donors in the easy way men do when they believe charm is an ethical category. Mara arrived 15 minutes after we did in a silver dress that made 3 men go visibly quieter when she passed them, and 1 woman stopped mid-sentence to stare. Vivienne saw her, then saw me see her, then saw that I did not look away. That was when the first real flicker of fear crossed her face. Not because she knew everything, because some primitive part of her understood control had shifted somewhere, and she had not been in the room when it happened. The formal program started just after 9. Grant opened with the usual polished nonsense about community, vision, impact. Then the board chair spoke, then a museum trustee. Then, because Vivienne had built half the donor list and apparently still believed in ceremony, Grant invited me to come say a few words as the patient, brilliant husband who had supported so much of the work behind tonight. There it was, her final mistake, because she still thought I would choose decorum over clarity if enough eyes were watching. I walked to the stage with a glass in my hand, and the calm that comes only when grief has finally hardened into decision. The ballroom was quiet. I could feel Vivienne watching me from the front table, a smile fixed too carefully into place. Grant looked pleased, almost amused. I took the microphone. "Thank you," I said, and my own voice sounded distant and precise to me. "That's a generous introduction." A few people laughed softly. I let the silence settle again. "I've spent most of my adult life working with numbers," I said. "Patterns, risk, the small inconsistencies that tell you something is already broken long before the room is willing to call it broken." Now they were listening. Even the waitstaff had slowed. I looked at Vivienne then, not at Grant, not at the crowd, at my wife. She had stopped smiling. "When a marriage ends," I said, Most people think it happens in a dramatic moment. A confession, a slammed door, a scene. In my experience, it usually ends much earlier. Quietly, in private choices, in the habit of speaking tenderly to someone else, and strategically to the person who still thinks he's your home. No one moved. You asked me tonight not to embarrass you, I said to her, still calm. I won't, but I won't keep wearing the lie for you either. Her face went white, and then I said the line I had been carrying for 3 days. You stopped being my wife months ago. Tonight I'm just the man refusing to applaud it. Nothing exploded. That was the beauty of it. No screaming, no accusations hurled across linen and crystal. No spectacle vulgar enough to let them reduce me to the irrational husband. Just silence, fatal social silence. Grant took one step toward the stage, as if he could manage it. Myra never moved. Vivienne stared at me like she had never seen me before, and perhaps hadn't. I set the microphone down, stepped off the stage, placed my wedding ring beside my untouched water glass at our table, and left the ballroom without hurrying. That was the end of the marriage in public. Everything after that was logistics. The divorce was not dramatic. It was expensive, unpleasant, and exact. I knew too much to let sentimentality turn into vulnerability. She tried once to reframe the affair as emotional drift and mutual loss, and the tragedy of two people who had become strangers too gracefully to notice. That narrative died when the hotel records came in, and the financial trail connected. She had spent marital funds on private suites, gifts, and travel disguised as donor work. Grant had done the same through foundation accounts sloppy enough to panic counsel. Mara left him within 6 weeks. Vivienne expected, I think, that once the marriage was officially over, she could re-enter the emotional field and dictate the tone again. There were texts first. Can we not let the last thing between us be that stage? I'm trying to understand what happened to us. You used to be kinder than this. Then calls, then longer messages, as if quantity could force me back into intimacy. By then, Mara and I had stopped pretending what existed between us was incidental. It was not revenge anymore, if it ever truly had been. It was simply real, not pure, not blameless, but real. That fact drove Vivienne crazier than the public rejection had. When she found out, she came to the apartment we had not yet sold and stood in the kitchen. The same kitchen where she had once organized flowers for donor breakfasts and kissed me absent-mindedly while texting another man, and looked at me as if some final private right had been taken from her. "Myra," she said. I nodded. That was all. For a second, I thought she might throw something. Instead, she laughed once, sharp and unbelieving, then cried with the kind of rage that comes only when a person discovers their own behavior was never meant to happen to them in return. She was my friend. No, I said. She was your witness. That was the cruelest thing I said to her after the gala. It was also the truest. Time passed, more than a year. The divorce finalized. The apartment sold. Grant lost his board seat, and then most of his company. Because men like that rarely survive public fracture with their reputation, intact once the money people smell instability. Vivienne left the hospitality group before they could formally edge her out, spent 6 months consulting independently, then vanished into the kind of carefully vague independent advisory work women like her use when they need to sound important while the social dust settles. Myra and I did not rush toward each other theatrically. We built something slow and adult out of wreckage neither of us romanticized. She was more beautiful than Vivienne. Yes, though not in the obvious way. Smarter too, and never once careless with my dignity. But what actually mattered was simpler than any of that. She was honest in rooms where honesty cost something. That had become, for me, the rarest kind of beauty. Vivienne called me 19 months after the gala. Not drunk, not desperate, just quiet. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no. Then I heard something in her voice that sounded less like manipulation than exhaustion. And curiosity is one of my oldest flaws, so I agreed. We met on a gray Sunday in November at a little place off a store street, where the tables are too small for grand performances. She looked beautiful in the way certain women always will, no matter how badly they've behaved. Camel coat, hair shorter, no ringed, a face I had once believed I would keep memorizing for the rest of my life. For a minute, we talked like polite people with shared history. Work, the weather, a mutual friend's move to London, the absurdity of Chicago parking. Then she set down her cup and finally looked at me properly. I wanted to know if you ever missed me, she said. There it was. Not apology, not accountability. Still, even then, a referendum on her emotional value. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt something stranger and much cleaner. Distance. I looked at her and realized the woman I had mourned no longer existed in any form I could honestly love. Maybe she never had. Maybe part of marriage is discovering that the person you grieved was partly your own composition. I missed who I thought you were, I said. She flinched but didn't look away. And now, I thought of Myra reading in bed beside me, glasses sliding down her nose as she underlined things in biographies and legal memoirs. I thought of the first morning after I moved into her place temporarily during the apartment sale, when she set a cup of coffee beside my elbow without asking how I took it because she had paid attention. I thought of the complete lack of performance in our life together. Then I looked back at my ex-wife. "Now I don't," I said. She started crying very quietly. I didn't stop her. "I'm not asking you to come back," she said. Sometimes I still think about the version of us before everything got ruined." I let that sit there between us for a few seconds. "Vivienne," I said, and my own voice surprised me with how gentle it was. "The version of us you're talking about ended long before I stood on that stage." I just said it out loud first. That was the final refusal. No cruelty, no victory speech, no punishment in it. Just truth, delivered too late to save anything, and exactly on time to end it. When I left the cafe, it had started raining in that thin, expensive November way Chicago does. Cold enough to make everyone walk faster, light enough to keep them from admitting they're wet. I stood under the awning for a moment before crossing the street. My phone buzzed. A message from Myra. "Take your time. I made pasta. There are endings that feel dramatic. There are endings that feel deserved. And then there are the ones that feel like oxygen after holding yourself inside grief for too long." I put the phone back in my pocket and looked up once at the gray city and all its glass. Vivienne stayed inside the cafe, small through the window, one hand over her mouth, still trying to make meaning out of a life she had once believed she could rearrange without consequence. I didn't hate her then. That was the strangest part. I just wasn't hers anymore. And once a man reaches that kind of quiet, permanent detachment, there is nothing left to negotiate. I walked into the rain and went home.